Thomas Chatterton Williams. Is it okay if I call you Tommy Chatty Willie? Is that all right?
I prefer it if you just call me Thomas.
TC Dubs, what's on your mind this week? What's been bothering you?
You know, there's been a lot of talk about the NBA this week. We've been talking about who might get the MVP for this year, and there's been some debate. I think that there's three guys that you can't really be
Am I one?
mad. You're not one. You're not one of them.
Okay. Year. All right. Fine. No, that's okay. It's okay. Who are the three?
So you got Joel Embiid at the Philadelphia 76ers. You got Giannis. I can't pronounce his last name still, but he's really good on the Milwaukee Bucks.
The Bucks, yeah.
And you've got Nikola Jokic on the Denver Nuggets, who, if he wins this year, will get the MVP for the third straight year, which is really kind of crazy if you think about that in a league that never saw Michael Jordan or LeBron James or Kobe Bryant get it 3 times in a row. The last guy to get it.
Oh, really? That's nuts.
It's crazy, right?
Okay.
Last guy to get it 3 times in a row was Larry Bird. And so there's been some conversation about whether there's some bias,
so it's
some ethnic biase. Yeah.
We can't have anything not be racialized, can we?
You can't. It's honestly, it's exhausting. And, you know, Jokic is just, he's a gorgeous player. His game is beautiful. His vision is crazy. I mean, he grabs a rebound at one end of the court, turns on a pivot foot, and sails the ball down like a baseball pass for a layup. I mean, he's 7 feet tall. I mean, the guy plays like, I mean, you can't be mad at him getting the MVP. Whether or not, you know, there's a kid, I think that, you know, you can make.
It seems like the villain here is Larry Bird, right? The villain here is Larry Bird. He shouldn't have won it 3 times. And if he had,
the villain here for me, I don't care who gets the MVP as long as the league would actually start taking seriously what's just egregious traveling all the time, man. Okay. You have incredible athletes. You have gifted players like Ja Morant, and they're just taking 3, 4, 5 steps. And it's the league is just, it's plagued by a lack of fundamentals. I've actually gotten really red-pilled. I mean, I came up playing basketball. I cared about fundamentals. I got really red-pilled, though, lately through social media. I got turned on to more and more content. Dev in the Lab is the most amazing account to follow. He zeroes in on the violations. And once you start to look, you realize all of the top superstars, Kevin Durant, Steph Curry, everybody, Giannis, they're taking 4 steps. LeBron James, 4 steps. I don't know.
So you feel strong about this. I don't have a strong opinion on this, but the podcast is always more fun when I take the opposite side. So what I'm hearing...
You're going to argue the devil's advocate. We should not have rules.
Yeah, just to be difficult. I'm just going to argue the other side just for the fuck of it. What I'm hearing is you're saying what you like about the game is the bouncing of the ball, which is, and you're saying, I love it when they bounce it, and you hate it when they are athletes who are free to show off their athletic skill, and you want them to focus on fundamentals, specifically the fundamental of bouncing. That's your.
What is excellence within a game? It's doing certain feats in an athletic game, certain feats of athleticism within certain constraints, right? And basketball would be a very different game if you remove any number of constraints. If you made the rim lower, it'd be a different game. If you could take 4 steps, it's a different game. And it might be a cool game for seeing some highlights. Ja Morant gets some dunks off that you wouldn't get off if you couldn't travel. But also, we could spend a whole podcast talking about this, and I won't do it to you. But what's really bothering me is not just the traveling, but the carrying. I mean, you can just go down the line. Luka Doncic on the Mavs. Ja Morant. I'm going to keep going in on Ja Morant because this man, he's an extraordinary athlete. He's abusing every single one of the rules. This man is carrying the ball in a way that I can't watch basketball with my dad anymore. My 85-year-old dad is traumatized by what he's seeing on the screen. And I'm pilled on it, man.
Okay. It's good to feel passionately about anything, but
this might be the thing I care about the most today.
To take the other side, so my vision of the NBA would be outlandish skill and rim-rattling dunks, and your vision would be well-executed chess passes. Okay, you can say which vision is more compelling.
There's a place for it all. We're going
to have to table it there because we got a lot to talk about today. Stuff that, believe it or not, is maybe even more important than traveling in the NBA. Though maybe not much more important. Let's talk about this Chris Rock special. You see that Chris Rock special on Netflix?
I did. It was making the rounds in my group chat.
Okay. And what were the thoughts?
So, I think that we were waiting to see if it would be really funny. Chris Rock for me is always really funny. He's my favorite, my personal favorite comedian. I actually played myself in Paris not so long ago when I noticed that he was sitting and talking to a rather younger woman very late at night at the Hotel Cost when I was finishing up probably too many drinks.
They were probably talking about traveling in the NBA.
They might have been.
Or perhaps
she was not
teen mental health, which is also on our to talk about list.
I came up to Chris Rock.
We can't know what they were talking about in that context, but continue.
Don't know, but know that I was an unwelcome presence when I came up to him and told him that he was my favorite comic in the 90s. I don't think he liked that I dated him right there. he was not feeling me. I kind of excused myself very quickly after he said, thank you.
People don't like that when you come to this, say, hey, when I was a really little kid and you were like mid-career, that was like awesome.
Drunk guy saying that he liked you when he was a kid. When you're trying to holler at a girl 25 years younger, then you must actually not be welcome.
Can I say this? So I don't know Chris Rock, but I have been at the table at the Comedy Cellar with him because the Comedy Cellar, you might know, is this comedy club in New York. Legend. And it is a mix of nobodies like myself and very big names will drop by. So Chris Rock will drop by, Seinfeld, Louis C.K. Chappelle, they drop by. And while you're waiting for your set, you sit at that table. There's the club's downstairs. There's a restaurant upstairs. You sit at the table, wait for your set.
Down there.
What's that?
Your peers down there. You're sitting at a table together.
It's really cool for people like me because, yes, in a way, we're peers. In a more realistic way, we're definitely not. But we are sitting at the same table, so that's true. I'll tell you, people coming up to him and saying, "Oh man, I love your stuff." That is his whole night every night. That is his whole night. Every night.
Giving him new information.
Yeah, they were probably.
It was just painful. Thank you.
There were probably 3 dozen people behind you waiting to tell him the same thing. But okay, so this is all personal. This is all personal.
No, so he's my favorite. So he can't ruin the love I have for Bring the Pain and all these things, Bigger and Blacker.
And by the way, we share this. I love those albums too. His 90s stuff was awesome.
Yeah. I love Top 5. I love his movies. I love, what is it? Cell Block. CB4. I like when he's cut. I'm gonna get you, sucker. When he's like, give me one rib. I love Chris Rock. But I have to, this is Wrongthink, and I guess I'm gonna say what I really think about this is that I don't think Will Smith has been treated fairly.
Okay.
To be honest, this has less to do with Chris Rock than it has to do with us as an audience and us as a culture. Okay. Will Smith, at what point, has somebody been diminished enough? Has somebody been dragged enough, ruined enough? And what I thought was really amazing about Chris Rock was how elegantly he handled Will Smith's obvious violation. For about a year, Chris Rock took this high road that was really kind of, you don't see it very often. And in the course of hosting the Oscars, when Will Smith slapped him, he was impeccably professional. And I just didn't know if it was necessary for him to finally come out and make the kind of jokes. None of it was new. It was all stuff we knew, but it was extraordinarily mean-spirited. And maybe Chris Rock needed to get that off his chest. And as a comic, he almost had a duty to. You know how that goes. He had to address the material at some point. But why did we, if we don't like the kind of incivility that Will Smith demonstrated, why do we then celebrate watching the kind of really nasty personal incivility that Chris Rock gets a chance to unleash on him now? I saw a lot of people actually on Twitter. You couldn't predict how people would react. A lot of people on Twitter seemed to have that sentiment too. Like, what are we celebrating at this point? This man, Will Smith, she didn't kill anybody. He's not the worst person in the world. But for a moment, it felt like, we just unleashed, this period of hate on him. The entire world did in a way that feels extraordinarily disproportionate to me. I wonder what you think.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. And I definitely do agree. Let the punishment fit the crime. I don't know what the appropriate, punishment for Will Smith. I know he's been banned from the Oscars for 10 years. Maybe that's
10 years.
10 years. That's a long, well, guess what, man? I'm not going for the rest of my life. So most of us are informally banned from the Oscars. In fairness, most of us not actors, but I don't know. I would have to sit down and really, really think about what is the appropriate punishment for Will Smith. I got better ways to spend my time than that, but I do definitely strongly agree with the principle: let the punishment fit the crime. There has to come a point, especially depending on how he conducts himself, right? If he really does seem to realize that was not the right thing to do, I fucked up there. Was that?
It seems like he did. At what point does somebody actually, at what point do we extend grace in this culture is something that I constantly am thinking about.
Yeah.
At what point, this man paid his price for losing his temper in what seemed like a very emotionally fraught moment for him. He came undone in front of all of us. Seems like he's really been through it.
Yeah.
Seems like he wants to get past it. At what point do we allow somebody to get past a misstep?
Yeah. No, I agree 1,000% that we are maybe not as good as I'm being very polite in my phrasing. We're maybe not as good as we could be. We are. What did you think? Would be another way to phrase it. We are shitty at extending grace to people. We should probably extend more grace to them. Certainly, there has to come a point, because you're right. He lost his head. He did something he shouldn't have done. There are worse crimes. There has to come a point where you say you're past it. I don't. Anything that happens in the immediate aftermath, like. Strangely, or after he did that, he won an Oscar, which is the weirdest moment in which to have to atone. Anything that happens in that moment, I kind of take it and I sort of throw it away, because I know it's all managers and agents. It's like his publicist was down there immediately talking to him. I don't. It's impossible for me to know what you actually think about what you just did right then. Maybe let me ask you again in 3 months, and then I might get your real feelings on the thing. But yes, at some point we have to forgive Will Smith. And Chris Rock. So first of all, it's jokes. I'm always prone to take the stand-ups side, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I'm not big on group identity except for stand-up comics. Those are my people.
That's your tribe.
Well, that's my tribe. So I'm biased. He had to do some jokes about it. I mean, it's like it's the elephant in the room. It's like when Louis C.K. came back. It's like you have to say something at some point. And I thought the way he got into it, he did a joke about like how much bigger than Will Smith is. I thought that was very funny. Jokes about, he said, I don't want to like do the whole bit because that'll ruin it. But just like people ask, did it hurt? He's like, it still hurts. That's very funny. I thought he got into it in a very funny way. I agree that the last bits when he's talking about like Jada Pinkett Smith and stuff. I
that's
could have
tough.
done without that.
It's tough.
Yeah, it's tough. And you know what? I don't know if I like blame Chris Rock that much, because it is comedy. And also that's like a humiliating thing to get slapped on national television. And then anyone who didn't happen to be watching it right then, well, they certainly saw it the next day, right? So
I think the entire world saw that, man. I was in Europe, man. It was huge in France. It's crazy. It's crazy. But everybody in the world saw that slap. That is crazy.
So they were talking about that in France?
Oh, yeah, dude.
Wow.
I mean, you can't hide from that. That's true. It's like, what does it mean to get slapped by like one of the biggest movie stars living at the Oscars? Forever, he's got that attached to him. That's tough too.
It's just the weirdest. You're wearing a tuxedo and you get smacked by the Fresh Prince. It's like a Mad Libs of weird-ass ways to get humiliated.
Do you remember that though? It was a fucking weird moment. Like, that was a bizarre pop cultural, are we in a simulation moment?
Yeah, I remember I was working on my computer and my wife came in and like her eyes are wide and she goes, "Did you hear what happened?" I'm like, no. She goes, "Will Smith smacked Chris Rock at the Oscars." And I was like, you're going to have to say that again. Because there's Will Smith? Like the smiley, the like Independence Day
cleanest actor in Hollywood. Yeah, it's insane. It's incredible.
On everyone's top 5 list of the most likable dudes, just committed assault at the Oscars.
Also, but like, I mean, so many of my friends just couldn't believe it was real because his form was impeccable. He just like leaned back. It was so executed, and he caught him exactly on the cheek. It's hard to imagine doing that. It's just
he played Muhammad Ali.
He did.
You know, actors train. They have professionals train them.
The movement was impeccable. It was extraordinary. I have friends who just swear that there's no way that wasn't like choreographed, because you just cannot slap somebody like that one try, one movement, clean.
Boy, that seemed pretty pretty spontaneous to me.
Oh yeah, that was some incredible TV. I mean, I don't know what to say about that. We could talk about the slap for an hour. I love Chris Rock. He's always my goat. I don't think anybody has a funnier voice. I love Dave Chappelle. I think Chris Rock just personally resonates with me in a way that it's hard to explain exactly why. His face and his voice make me laugh.
He is really an original in that Chris Rock does the Chris Rock voice. Like, he does that cadence.
Yeah.
And it's been often mimicked, but nobody before him did that cadence. That's like his cadence. And it's such an awesome, I'm going to get way into the comedy weeds here.
Yeah,
it's such an awesome comedy cadence because he uses fewer words. Nobody knows this about comedy. I mean, comedians do. Non-comedians don't know. It's like fewer words is key. And he's the best at it because he will say it like this. And by the way, also, when I started doing stand-up in the 2000s, so many comics pacing like Chris Rock. Like that really rubbed off on a lot of people.
Bring the pain. He's pacing that stage. Yeah.
He's still doing it.
Yeah.
No, I agree that I love Chris Rock, and I will cut him a lot of slack because it is humiliating to get slapped at the Oscars, and then people in France are talking about it. That's a rough way to go. So okay, I'm giving you a wide berth. I do agree that maybe the absolute best response would have been no malice returned to Will Smith whatsoever, which is a difficult thing to summon.
Imagine that. I mean, I actually think that would be so powerful.
Yeah.
If he could have done that, because what he did in the moment was powerful. If he could have actually stayed at that level, I think we'd be talking about that a lot more than this kind of forgettable Netflix series.
I think you're probably right. And we'll leave it there. Speaking of fights, maybe we should have a segment called Who's Thomas Fighting With on Twitter this week?
It's easy to talk about what other people should do. I got advice for other people on how to react.
Just to briefly revisit what we just talked about, that's why it would have been so amazing if Chris Rock had just elevated himself and returned no malice to Will Smith, because that's really, really hard to do. And you certainly didn't get in a down, dirty, and ugly fight with anybody.
No, I really try not to fight on Twitter. That you can't win. It's Twitter really makes both people look bad. You don't look good. It's
a terrible, terrible place to hang out. But you did engage in a little Thomas on Thomas crime. You got in an exchange with Thomas Zimmer.
Fact, Thomas. The etymology of Thomas is twin. Just going to put that out there.
What now?
The etymology of the name Thomas in the Aramaic is twin.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So possibly you got in a fight with your own twin. Is that what you're saying?
Man. There was an evil Thomas out there.
Yeah. Well, okay. So say you. But you know what? The evil Thomas would say
has his own
the
perspective.
Other one was the evil Thomas. So I don't know which Thomas to believe. But why don't you run us through your, honestly, respectful disagreement with Thomas Zimmer? What were you?
Thomas Zimmer is a guy. I don't really know who he is, to be honest. He's a name that sometimes pops up on my Twitter feed. So it's not the first time I've seen him, but I don't know who he is. Every time I see him, it's often in the capacity of critiquing the people, the so-called liberals from his leftist perspective, who would criticize things like so-called cancel culture at a time when, the authoritarian right is so dangerous that how could we ever point out what's wrong on the left? Apparently he's a historian at Georgetown, which brings me some pain because that's my alma mater.
But that was mine too, right?
Dude, I did not actually know that. I didn't know that. What year?
Yeah, man. We were at 2002. We were at Georgetown at the same time.
We were, I'm 03.
Yeah. Me, you, John Mulaney, and Ivanka Trump. We're all at Georgetown.
Ivanka was there. She was always smoking outside of Lowenger Library.
Was she really?
She worked hard. It looked like she worked hard. She was always in the library, except for weekends when she flew back private, I heard. But
okay.
she flew back to New York City.
She was in my biblical lit class. I do not believe I laid eyes on her one time. But
oh, really? I saw her in the library constantly.
Okay. I'm sorry, I got us way off track. But yes.
That's
so everyone involved in this is named Thomas and went to Georgetown. Basically,
this is crazy.
Yeah.
Well, he teaches at Georgetown. I don't know where he studied,
okay.
But it's this kind of thing that I don't know what to say anymore, because it's like there's a certain kind of cohort on Twitter who every few months or every few weeks, if events dictate, they'll just mention that, some signatories or people behind the Harper's letter or people who decry cancel culture haven't commented on something that they think is really important, or they'll say that, we'll not be talking about, the fact that the greatest threat to freedom of expression comes from Ron DeSantis in Florida. And, I actually agree that that's I don't know. It's difficult to say what the greatest threat is, but informal censoriousness can be quite powerful, even sometimes more so than explicit censoriousness. But perhaps Ron DeSantis is the greatest threat to freedom of expression in America. The fact is that 2 years ago, I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times saying that. But it doesn't matter how many times you say that, because you have criticized the left, you're going to constantly get this type of critique that he brings out here, which is, he's doing his long tweet thread promoting his Substack. And in one of the tweets, he says, an interview with Thomas Chatterton Williams in the New Yorker is actually an excellent example of how the quote unquote evidence quickly evaporates when exposed to even the slightest scrutiny. When pressed, TCW, Ta-Nehisi Coates pointed this out years ago. When anybody starts calling you by your initials, they don't have your best interests. If you don't know me and you're calling me TCW, except for you.
I don't call you TC Dubs because you don't want me to call you Tommy Chatty Willie. If you want me to call you Tommy Chatty Willie, we can go back to that.
If we don't personally know each other and you're criticizing me, you're calling me TCW, that's suspect. But when pressed, TCW brings up 2 cases of academics who were supposedly silenced, and so then he points to 2 academics who were put through a ridiculous amount of scrutiny and review at their institutions. And ultimately, they somehow managed to hold on to their employment. And that's supposed to be proof that cancel culture doesn't exist. Whereas I think that a conclusion we could easily arrive at is that has a powerful onlooker effect for anybody else who's like, I don't want to go through that. So whatever they did, even if they were found not to be guilty of any, offense that can get you in trouble, I'm going to not even go that far. That's exactly how cancel culture works. It's not about the number of people who lose their jobs. It's about fostering a culture in which people are afraid to say things and do things and be associated with certain perspectives and ideas, and afraid to make mistakes. Again, can we even make mistakes in this culture? Right. And so, it's this kind of thing that comes up over and over and over again. And, he was the latest to do it this week. And so, I responded to that. I said, I'm just so tired of people either being, disingenuous or painfully oblivious, that left censoriousness is a real thing out there, And so I said, let's make this as simple as possible. Just break down to me what happened to James Bennett at the New York Times in the summer of 2020 when he lost his job for overseeing the opinion section, when a sitting senator wrote an opinion that I think polls still show most Americans would agree with, saying that if you can't control rioting in inner cities, consider bringing in the military. I don't agree with that point of view necessarily, but any opinion section in a national newspaper can publish a sitting senator that's making even a provocative point, who was extraordinarily qualified, if you read the piece. But, there was a kind of insurrection at the New York Times. Staffers went on Twitter and they said that running the piece put them, specifically Black staffers, at physical danger. And he lost his job. And so if there's no such thing as cancel culture, I don't even like the term, but if that thing doesn't exist, that Thomas Zimmer of Georgetown, and painfully of Georgetown University says, and if that doesn't exist, just explain to me what it was that happened to James Bennett.
Yeah.
No
answer. Am I correct
answer.
in assuming he did not respond?
No.
Okay.
Not to that. He responded in a billion different ways about how, of course I wasn't going to get, Thomas Chatterton Williams to see that what's so obvious to anybody, but like he didn't respond to that specific question of what happened to James Bennett, because they never do.
I find it unbelievable that there are people who think we don't have a problem with censoriousness in the United States. That they think that is not something that anybody feels, that is not a realistic threat that anybody lives under in any circumstance. It just blows my mind. Chris Rock actually started his special, which I thought his special was pretty funny. My least favorite part was at the beginning, just because I didn't think it was that funny, talking about cancel culture. Because I'll tell you something, every comic feels this, and every comic, my 10 years of stand-up was 2005 to 2020. I stopped when COVID hit. I was like, that's it. Every comic noticed a change. It was just absolutely impossible to miss. And that's why you hear comics.
What year would you say that set in? What year? What year did you really started to?
The mid 2010s, things started to get weird. And then when Trump got elected, that was just, the doors got blown off the place. And I'll tell you what, in both directions too, because Trump's elected, it's kind of the elephant in the room. So you want to talk about it, but I go on the road. I wasn't in New York all the time. I'd go on the road and you would get crowds that are just like, do not say a word about Trump. I love that man. It's like, shit, I'm really not having fun now. So
would you also say that, and not to sidetrack you, but would you also say that Donald Trump specifically was so cartoonish and over the top in some ways, and he is funny. I find him reprehensible, but the man can make you laugh. Would you say that is hard to do comedy about when the president himself is that absurd and kind of comical?
Yes, 100%. Your intuitions are correct. That when the thing itself is funny, it's hard as a comic. There's a term for this: hat on a hat. It means the thing's already there. You don't need to add something to it. So yes, Trump would do something ridiculous. And this happened all the time when I was writing for John Oliver on Last Week's Night. Trump does something ridiculous and you don't need to tell a joke after it. He is the joke.
Right.
Yeah. Right. So if you go back and watch those clips, and I don't recommend that you do, but so often it'll be Trump doing something ridiculous. And then the reaction, whether it's from John or Seth Meyers or Colbert or whoever, they're just kind of like, unbelievable, right? It's like you really barely need a joke because he was so ridiculous, and I can talk for hours about how
you to drink bleach.
Yeah, yeah. Because a lot of times comedians bring out the funny thing, right? They point to the thing that's absurd about it. You don't need any pointing when he's instructing people to drink bleach. Yeah, but I find it impossible that anybody thinks this isn't at least a problem some places sometimes. Maybe it's because I work in comedy and you work in academia. We're kind of in the eye of the hurricane. We see this all around us all the time. But there is a database.
I would also say, it's worse in the media than it is in academia, I would say, even.
Oh my God. I hate to think of fields where it's worse than my field. You think it's worse in the in media? Perhaps because of James Bennett, which I think was a huge moment in American media?
I think that everybody saw what happened to him.
Yeah.
I had a lot of private exchanges going with a lot of different people. And I also was, I was privy to a variety of people who don't necessarily make their opinions heard on social media, who were quite shaken up by how you can. He was one of the three people, probably the front runner, considered next in line to be the executive editor of the New York Times. And within a couple of days, he was destroyed.
Yeah. He is also
running an op-ed by a sitting U.S. senator expressing an opinion that was not even a fringe opinion.
That was my strongest take on the whole thing. And I did not agree with Tom Cotton's opinion, but I also do want to read an editorial page where there are opinions that I don't agree with. And I do feel like Tom Cotton is a sitting senator, and I want to know what's in his head.
You do. And I'm sorry, but the New York Times is not platforming him. He's already platformed. It's not if you don't let him use this op-ed platform, those ideas will not get out to the public. I mean, Tom Cotton has the platform. The New York Times has published, I believe they have published Hitler They have published, certainly more recently, Narendra Modi in India, who's overseeing human rights abuses. Let's be honest.
Not a good guy.
And he's a head of state, and there's a reason why they published an op-ed by Modi.
Vladimir Putin has had.
I'm sure he's got a byline.
Also, you and I. It's just a
long
list of ne'er-do-wells.
I'm a repeat offender in those pages. I don't know if we should scratch that. We maybe have to. I don't want to get canceled. I'm a repeat offender in those pages. I'm kidding.
We'll see if we can edit that. I think maybe because I was talking and you were talking, we're going to have to leave it in.
I'm a little bit worried of people.
The James Bennett thing was an earthquake. And it was not just James Bennett. Andrew Sullivan at New York Mag got forced out. Matt Iglesias at a publication he founded at Vox
for signing the Harper's letter.
Yes, for signing the Harper's letter was, it's like I think the upshot is he said, I'm done with this nonsense and left. Officially.
Both of those guys ended up making exponentially more once they went as early movers to Substack.
Yeah, and good for them.
Andrew Sullivan made more than 10 times his salary or something like that within a year.
Yeah. Which I think is a direct. I think it just goes to show people don't want fearful, cowed news. They want to hear what people think. I read Andrew Sullivan. I disagree with him all the time. He's way more conservative than I am. But I enjoy reading him.
I read people constantly that I disagree with because isn't that interesting, actually? Isn't that intellectually challenging?
I picked a fight with you about traveling 30 minutes ago just because the disagreement is more interesting than...
You were defending playing the game of basketball without rules.
And you are a monster for that. But it does happen. And there is, I mentioned, there is a database of this. Fire is basically what the ACLU used to be.
They're doing great work.
Yeah, they do great work. They're talking about free speech. They actually do compile a compendium of, cancellations, however you may define that term. You may go through and think, well, that's not a cancellation. You may think, well, that's small potatoes. That's a big deal. But it's several hundred incidents, I'll tell you that. So there is an answer to the question, who has actually been canceled? But I completely agree that it is the chilling effect that is the bigger thing. It's certainly the thing that I feel as a writer, that I'm always afraid of saying the wrong thing. And I really, on this podcast, on this Substack, I try to say the thing I actually think because that's all that's interesting. But yeah, you feel it. And the idea that that's not out there is shocking to me.
You think that there's another editor that's going to risk going out like that? Did you read James Bennett's, the interview he gave a couple months ago where they asked him about the firing? Yeah.
And he apologized for nothing. Okay, here it is. This is what James Bennett told Ben Smith of Semaphore. He said, "My mistake was trying to mollify people." Speaking of Times publisher A.G. Sulzberger, he said he blew the opportunity to make clear that the New York Times doesn't exist just to tell progressives how progressives should view reality, and that Sulzberger set me on fire and threw me in the garbage. And then he wrote back to Ben Smith and said,
"Tell him how you really feel. Tell him how you really feel."
Yeah, I thought it was awesome. I mean, maybe I'm being a hypocrite by saying Chris Rock should have elevated himself and then cheering on James Bennett when he says he lit me on fire and threw me in the garbage. I should think about what my principles are.
Well, I think what happened to James Bennett is a lot more severe than a slap.
He was fired. He was fired.
Not only is he fired, he's
gig.
Stigmatized still.
Yes. Well, I mean, I respect him for doing things like this. He wrote back to the reporter and said, one more thing that sometimes gets misreported. I never apologized for publishing the piece and still don't. Damn.
Damn. Yeah, no, that's right.
And I don't think he should be apologetic. I think he was screwed, and I don't think he should. Yeah.
And Eric Wemple, W-E-M-P-L-E at the Washington Post.
Yeah, the Washington Post, yeah.
He had a good piece several months ago, too, about how there's quite a lot of consensus that was an enormous mistake now. And, there are some indications that was a moment of excess that we are actually no longer in the midst of, that the Times itself no longer reacts to certain controversies with such immediate capitulation. And if that's the case, that's a good thing. I don't want my whole life to be decrying cancel culture ad infinitum until I'm in a coffin. I hope that we actually get out of this moment and we talk about other things. But this zombie corpse of people jumping on Twitter like Thomas Zimmer to say that, and another thing, cancel culture isn't real, except if it happened in this case, that person deserved it. This has to stop. But these people, you can't actually argue with them. You can't argue with somebody to see something that they will say doesn't exist, and then when it does exist, it was warranted. It's just you just can't do it. You have to persuade the onlookers. You can't engage. You can't persuade the people that refuse to see it.
That's true. And you know what? I would settle for this compromise. Whenever people talk about, how big is cancel culture? How big of a part of a society is it? I would settle for, can we just agree that when it happens, it's bad? Maybe it is overblown. And certainly, overblown. Yeah, it could definitely be overblown. A lot of things are overblown.
Sure.
Perhaps. Can we just agree that when something like what happened to James Bennett happens, that's bad? I'd settle for just that. Maybe that
would already be an amazing improvement.
Yeah. All right, let's move on. There was a survey. The CDC did its biannual survey. And by the way, it kills me that biannual can either mean twice a year or once every 2 years. I can't believe we don't have two separate words for that. John McWhorter, you're a word guy.
Are you sure? I always thought it was every 2 years biannual.
My understanding, and this is the type of thing, if we get fucking grammar Twitter on us for this, I will never forgive myself. You should maybe edit this out just so I don't have to deal with grammar Twitter. But my understanding is that biannual can mean twice a year or once every 2 years.
I thought it was the latter. Interesting. I mean, I could be wrong. Do we need to consult ChatGPT?
No, because it'll give us a wrong answer.
The wrong answer.
It'll just dig us deeper. Nor am I going to delve into the comments. I swear to God, anyone who leaves a comment about that in the comment section, I'm not going to reply to you.
Grammar scolds are the best commenters, though. They get on you. I
like to be really harsh on our audience. Tell them what's what. Anyway, the biannual CDC survey of teenage health found that teenagers are reporting the highest rates of poor mental health in a decade. The stat that I saw is that 2/3 of teen girls report feeling persistent sadness. 2/3. And if you look at it's very high numbers. Interestingly, so two things are interesting. Number one, there's a big uptick around 2012, and we'll get to why that might be.
John Haidt writes about The Coddling of the American Mind is an important book on this.
Yeah,
John Haidt
exactly
of Fire.
We'll get to that. I just want to throw in one more thing before we loop back to that, which is that Matt Iglesias pointed out there's also a political dynamic to this. And I wrote a piece about this on my Substack. I might be wrong, .substack.com, which is and again, Matt Iglesias was the first to point this out. Liberal teens are more depressed than conservative teens. My take is, I don't know if that means that, maybe liberal parents are encouraging their teenagers to report injury and be depressed, or maybe it's conservative parents are sort of, encouraging their kids to, just walk it off, toughen up. Could be both. But it definitely does seem to relate to the thing that Jonathan Haidt talks about.
Haidt, I believe.
Haidt.
Oh,
okay,
maybe, no, it might be Haidt. I'm bad on knowing exactly how you pronounce people's last names. It might be Haidt. I think it is Haidt.
Johnny
Wempley.
Johnny Haidt talks about this in The Coddling of the American Mind, and also has written about it on his Substack. I think he makes a persuasive case that a large part, not the entire part, but a large part of what's going on is teenagers and their access to phones and how their social circles are phone-based now, and they get a lot of negative stuff about body image and how they should be living their lives. What do you think about that? Do you find that convincing?
I find that partially convincing. I saw also today that my colleague at The Atlantic, Derek Thompson, who's always pretty incisive, was making the point that it has something to do with the extraordinary pressure cookers that are like our competitive high schools now. And I wonder if that has something to do with the liberal conservative divergence that, in New York City and San Francisco and these places where you've got these super competitive elite schools, kids are probably skewing liberal, and they're certainly under enormous pressure to perform and to do all types of extracurriculars and to compete in the meritocracy in ways that I don't even think, when we were coming up, we're basically the same generation. I mean,
Yeah.
I couldn't get into Georgetown again with my high school, with what I put up in high school. I didn't I didn't have 6 APs and all these extracurriculars. And, so, I wasn't like traveling abroad to do community service and stuff. These kids are under enormous pressure. So I wonder if it has a mix of that, The Coddling of the American Mind by Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff, which I think is one of the seminal books of the past decade. It's also like a parenting manual. It's just amazing common sense. They certainly make the strong case that this generation that started hitting colleges around 2013, 2014, was specifically fragile and not resilient in certain ways, and was under a lot of stress by social media and, the kind of chaotic, disruption to our ways of being that, internet technology and these smartphones we walk around with have wrought. There's something to all of that, I think, but I don't know. Yeah. It's one of those questions. I was having dinner the other night with an undergrad, with another professor and an undergrad at a pretty nice Italian restaurant. And, this is not my student. And, they were just telling me at some point, they mentioned like offhandedly even, they said, well, I just walk around with the mentality, I understand that I could die at any moment. And I was like, what do you mean? And they were like, I could get shot at any moment. What? Do you think get shot at any moment?
I don't know this person. I've never met this person. Do you think that is something a person says because they want you to go, oh man, that's like, man, you're living a hard life. You're an interesting person. Do you think that's the reaction they wanted?
Well, because there were about 10 students at 2 tables at this restaurant, and all of them were nodding in agreement. They were like, schools get shot up every day in America. I was really blown away because I don't remember ever feeling like that. I don't remember people talking like that. They were also talking about the danger of climate. They were 18, 19 years old. So not so different than the high school age students that are in these statistics you're citing. They were stressed and feeling set upon by the world in ways that I was not. And my friend group was not. And I'm talking about like the hood kids I grew up with in New Jersey and like the kids that I met later at like a nice university. None of us were feeling beset upon like that.
No, but Columbine had just happened when we were in college.
Right. But it didn't feel like that was something that was going to I didn't walk around saying like that could happen to me any day now.
No, me either. And this is what Matt Iglesias wrote his article about, was that there is sometimes this climate of doomerism on the left, which I think is completely true, especially because I write a lot about climate change. I worked for the EPA for 9 years, so climate's kind of my area. There's a lot of climate doomerism, which I'm a person who, like I said, I write about climate change a lot. I'm worried about it. It's a problem. I see it as a problem that needs to be worked. I don't have this imposing sense of doom about it. A super weird thing is that if you think of the worst case scenarios with climate change, there is also a sense of, yeah, but we'll all be dead, which is exactly why it's so difficult to get action on it right now. Because the truth is, you and I, and even the 19-year-old you're talking to, are not really at risk. It's more like
from your lips to generation after us. From your lips to the ears of God.
Yeah. So I don't know. I think it's so. Iglesias' point is that, which I think is a good one, is that there does seem to be this really depressive affect. What I talked about in my article, because I agree with Iglesias, but I think there's something more than that. I think sometimes if you have a parent who is super responsive to any injury a kid might suffer, and obviously it's good to be somewhat responsive. You don't want to be a block of ice, right? But if you have a parent who's super responsive, you might learn as a child, and as I'd say as a 19-year-old, you're still likely to be repeating patterns that you learned when you were younger. You are likely to learn that anything you might be afraid of, any injury you might feel, any fear you might have, play that up because you're going to get a response to it. And when the person in this big crowd of people, like you were saying, says like, "Oh man, I'm worried about schools getting shot up," nobody like pipes up and says, "Well, like statistically, your odds of that, it's like getting struck by lightning." That's just not a polite thing to say, so nobody says it, right?
It's true, man, but it's across the board. It's with adolescence, but it's also, catastrophizing, really like taking, numbers that are not indicative of a threat to you directly and making it seem like, I got to be honest, this happens in the racial conversation. America has an extraordinarily violent police industrial complex. I live in France. Maybe 18 people a year in France are killed in police custody. Maybe that would be like a big year. And it's a nation of, almost 70 million people. So it's not as big as the United States, but proportionally, America kills more people. We kill in police custody, unarmed, probably between 1,000 and 1,500 people a year in America. It's bad. Of those, maybe 250 will be black. That's also bad. That's disproportionate. You have more likelihood as a black man to be wrongfully killed in police custody than you do if you're not black. And yet the discourse can reach a level of, I got to say, catastrophizing, where people will say, "I know that I can walk." I'll tell you, I was in, remember Clubhouse? The app that dropped.
I thought you were talking about some place at Georgetown. I was like, no, I didn't hang out much.
Bizarre moment in the pandemic where Clubhouse dropped, and like you could just find yourself talking to random people. And I was in this room thanks to my buddy Camille Foster. It was Camille Foster, myself, Coleman Hughes, and some other people, including MC Hammer. And MC Hammer tells me...
That is not the name I expected you to say next.
Wasn't the name I was expecting to tell me about the risk.
It was me, Camille Foster, Coleman Hughes, and guess who the fourth person was?
No, there were a bunch of people, but MC Hammer was one
Alf?
of them.
Close. MC Hammer.
MC Hammer says, and he's a successful venture capitalist now. And he says that, he knows that his son can walk out the door tomorrow as a black man and die. But because in police custody. And I say, no, he won't. No, he won't.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
it's not going to happen.
Technically, could happen. Could happen.
What could
very unlikely?
An asteroid can hit it, but it's not going to happen. Mathematically, it's as good as zero, and it has never happened to somebody like MC Hammer's son in recent memory. It's not happening. But he was convinced that was a real risk every day. Or he was in the rhetorical mode of insisting that it was. I don't know if he truly believes it in his court. You don't know what people truly believe. I don't know if this student really believed that someone's going to shoot up her college. I don't know if MC Hammer really believes that. But, words get tossed around now like genocide. I'm rereading because I'm working on a book. What's that?
I said we really toss the word genocide around. It's
we do.
way too much, yeah.
Working on a book about 2020, and the amount of times that people said there's a genocide, is horrific what happened to George Floyd. There's a genocide happening, but that's a serious term. That means something. Mm-hmm. It means something. So I don't. It's not just adolescence. I think it's really like the lens that you're looking at this phenomenon with through teen girls. It means something, but it's something much more ambient in the culture.
Yeah, you used the word catastrophizing, and I think that's a good word. Both Matt Iglesias and Noah Smith, in response to this very study that we're talking about, talked about mental health strategies and how basically, and I hope I'm characterizing the argument correctly, but mental health best practices do not include catastrophizing. Catastrophizing and seeing problems as bigger than they are. We have polling now about how many, and I don't have the polls in front of me, so I'll have to, generalize, but liberals believe that far more unarmed black men are killed every year than there are are
Exponentially,
actually.
we believe exponentially more are killed. Yeah.
Exponentially more. Yeah. Not every liberal. I know, I've seen the data, and it's I don't know why it's so hard for liberals sometimes to say it's, any number that's higher than 0 is too many. Police
Mhm.
brutality is a problem. This is something we will continue to work on. And yet let's get the right number. Let's not believe the problem is bigger than it is. I often wonder if my feelings on catastrophizing and blowing threats out of proportion are what they are because I'm 42 and terrorism was all anybody talked about in the 2000s. So I sort of learned to have this posture where when people were talking about Al-Qaeda and the threats and the things that could happen, I was always like, okay, yeah, it's like it is a threat, but can we keep it in perspective? Because that is another case of people just coming to believe that the
In
threat was
mathematical
far greater than it
perspective.
actually was, even though it was real.
Right. I mean, you see, like we have people really have difficulty with probabilities. I mean, I'm certainly no exception. With the pandemic, we saw people just cannot think well in terms of real risk and probability assessment. And maybe we're also in a culture that encourages you to use rhetorical moves. This brings us back to the conversation about James Bennett. It's not accidental that people phrased the transgression in the language of harm and physical safety when they objected to the publication of the op-ed. That was a strategy. That there's an awareness that when you put issues and disagreements in the language of safety, that a different response is necessary now. That you get a kind of moral authority. You get it's a way to trump an argument. And, that can't be dismissed either. So there's a whole lot going on right now, and it's not just adolescence. It's distilled pretty clearly through the travails of teenage girls and the kind of, particular pressures they're under. But it's something much, much bigger than that, too.
Yeah, knowing just how much it sucks to be a teenager. And personally, I did not enjoy it. I would not want to go back to that time. I feel like that is inevitable when you're a teenager, right? It's like your hormones are nuts. I mean, as a guy, you should honestly be chained to a stake like a werewolf from the time when you're 15 to 25. Your hormones are just insane. Everyone around you is still learning how to be a person, so there are a lot of jerks. You've got pressures on you. I think it's interesting that you brought the thing about pressure in high school. Yeah, I'd love to see the data broken down that way. People who go to highly competitive high schools and kids that don't. That'd be really interesting. So many pressures, you're going to feel shitty. It doesn't help for adults who should know better to parachute in and go, you're right, everything's fucked.
Right, exactly. That doesn't help. And and you're probably going to get shot in school. It's
just, is the climate change or the school shooting going to get you first? That's the only question.
Man.
How do you want to go? Burned alive or shot through the heart? Yeah, that's not the message I want to give to my son.
No, it's not. Yeah.
Hey, speaking of people forming perceptions that are completely distorted and do not reflect how the world actually is, can we talk about Fox News before we go?
Yeah. That there were some amazing text messages that I saw going around.
Then why don't you lead us into it? Because they are a ton of fun.
So Tucker Carlson, some text messages to an unnamed recipient were released this weekend. We're going around TikTok.
It was me. I can reveal now. It was me.
Tucker Carlson says, quote, "We are very, very close to being able to ignore Trump most nights." He texted on January 4th, 2021. "I truly can't wait." Carlson, who had shared private meetings with the president and defended him on air, added in a text, "I hate him passionately. What he's good at is destroying things. He's the undisputed world champion of that. He could easily destroy us if we play it wrong." I mean, this is incredible. You can't make that up.
It's incredible. And it is the latest in a long string of incredible revelations from these texts. So we'll kind of go backwards and talk about some of those. But I do love this, partly because I find Trump to be such a despicable person And here you have someone who was probably his biggest cheerleader, arguably his biggest cheerleader in public.
After Hannity.
Yeah, right. Well, but top 5. He's certainly in the pantheon of Trump stooges.
Top
and here
5.
he is behind the scenes going, I can't fucking stand that guy.
It's amazing. And, and then he comes out with the January 6th documentary.
I don't think
carrying water for this man's lie. He did this whole Fox documentary on what
Patriot
really happened.
Purge?
Of course.
I watched Patriot Purge for my Substack. I watched that people owe me. I'm going to drive people to my Substack right now. The piece is called I might be wrong.substack.com. Let's watch Tucker Carlson's Patriot Purge and wonder just how dumb things can get. I watched all 4 parts of that thing. It is mind-blowing.
And this man is privately texting that he hates the president. The president destroys things.
Yes.
He's the champion of destroying things, world champion.
Yes.
And then he's carrying what? I mean, it's unbelievable.
It is unbelievable because it just goes to show how cynical people in media can be. And we are people in media. And this is, I also write about this on my Substack because I want people to know these are the pressures we feel. You figure out at some point what your audience wants to hear.
Audience capture.
Audience capture. There's a phrase for it. These Fox News texts reveal that they had given in to audience capture as badly as anyone has ever given into it.
They lost their own sense of a moral compass. They lost their own sense of reality. They defied the things that they themselves knew to be correct and true. It's almost easier to think it would be better if we thought like he really loved Trump. He believed that this was right and he was fighting for a cause he believed was just. This is so much worse than that.
Yes. Yes. It had been an open question for a long time. How did Tucker Carlson become this way? Because he used to be a regular guy. He used to be known for his.
He was actually a decent writer, a decent reporter.
He's that's the other thing. He's not dumb. He's not just, some cement head and you're like, well, he's just some fucking idiot. He's a sharp guy. You do wonder how and why does he come to be spouting all this bullshit? And now we have the answer. It's just, no, that's what my audience wants. Like you said, it's boring. It's bland. I just wanted good ratings.
Yeah. And I don't have it in front of me, but at some point a couple of weeks ago, one of the texts that was revealed from him was that even as he was criticizing Trump on air, he chastised another colleague for going against the Trump narrative because he said, like, basically, you're making the stock prices go down.
Yes. How dare she?
That's crazy.
He was mad because I believe I'm getting the correct instance. She had fact-checked a tweet of Trump's. And yes, that pissed Tucker Carlson off because she was making the stock price go down.
I mean, how do
you think Fox News viewers feel about this? Seeing these texts,
they don't. I know they do not care. They don't care.
Don't care. Okay.
They don't care, and that's one of the scariest parts about the whole thing. They don't care. We're so polarized. Anything that we said about the abuses that like James Bennett was subject to. The people on the team that believe that was the correct thing to do, they don't care. And the people on the team that just want, to fight for Team Trump, they don't care about what Tucker Carlson says privately in his text messages, so long as he's on TV saying what they want to see. This is the most disturbing reality. The polarization in this country is to such a degree that hypocrisy, factual inconsistencies, new arguments, new information doesn't move the needle.
So how do we fight against that? Because you and I are both in media in our own way. You more than me. But how do we fight against that? Because it is tempting to just give your audience what they want. And, we did a segment about censoriousness and cancel culture, and people know who you are. 3 people know who I am. We gave the view that they already know that we have, which is that it is bad to be censored. It has a chilling effect. We gave our spiel. People knew what our position was going to be. So, like, what do we do? Do we, come on and, give the opposite opinion? Or how does someone in media respond to this inclination to just tell the audience what they want to hear?
So my sense is that you have to always be wary of being captured by who you think your audience is, or allowing yourself to cultivate an audience that is so monolithic that there isn't diversity of thought within your audience. And, what I hope we're cultivating here, and what I always try to speak to in my writing in a mainstream publication, is that person who is not on one of those teams. There's a lot of people, More in Common is this wonderful think tank between Paris and London in the United States, run by my friend Mathieu Lefebvre. And they do all of these reports. Most people are not on either of those two poles. It tends to be that media is polarized around those two poles and plays to the it's like the primaries where you play to the most fervent, supporters in your base. The media is polarized that way, but most people are somewhere in the middle. And I think you have to address yourself to those people that can be persuaded, whether immediately or down the road. There's a lot of people like that out there who are not commenting, who are not making their opinions known, but are kind of watching, observing, listening. And that's where the whole game is, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. I do think we have learned that there is a market for news that is not just giving partisan talking points, because that is sort of what happened with Andrew Sullivan and Matt Iglesias, who we mentioned earlier. They got basically driven out of their own publications and
forced to become millionaires.
And were forced to become millionaires on Substack. That's right. Because people do want to read. Those guys are both just saying what they think, which is why I read them, which is why I find them interesting. It is also true that after the James Bennett situation at the New York Times, and after also Don McNeil was a similar situation. Where he got
Don McNeil, we could go into another podcast on that one. Yeah.
Very good reporter. It's a shame to lose him during COVID, especially. But I think the New York Times...
His reporting was saving lives.
Yeah, I thought he was a good reporter. I enjoyed his stuff during COVID. I think there are a lot of people in the Times that were taken aback by that and want to right the ship. And I think we have seen that. We can't recount this whole thing, but a couple weeks ago, there was a letter from GLAAD, Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, criticizing the New York Times for their coverage of trans issues. They cited a couple of articles that personally I felt were balanced. I thought GLAAD's claims, they had some quibbles, but I thought their claims were extremely overblown. And the New York Times responded by saying, "Thank you for your criticism. We stand by our reporting." Obviously, I'm paraphrasing there.
Right.
I think that is people in the New York Times pushing back and saying, we want to be a credible organization again. And I am one of many readers of the New York Times who's like, great, that is the New York Times I want. Fantastic. So there is a market for that, I think.
Yeah, that was a very heartening response. Joe Kahn, the new executive editor, I think he found the exact right tone. Now, there are a lot of people like Thomas Zimmer on Twitter, in that kind of tribe on Twitter who were not pleased with that response. But I think that your most representative reader of the New York Times was probably 100% behind the rationale that Joe Kahn and his colleagues laid out in their response. That's what people want from the paper of record, not to become captive to, their most activist, antagonists. So there are glimmers of light. I think let's put things in perspective, there's no comparison between what goes on in the New York Times and what we've been seeing yet again at Fox News. There's no comparison.
Very true.
But, I don't think that's not really a point that has to be won day in and day out. I think we basically all agree on that.
Yeah. And you're right. Let's keep things in perspective. Let's not succumb to the doomerism that we were just criticizing 10 minutes ago. I think it's important as people in media to try to be honest with what we're thinking, try not to be ideological, try to call them as we see them. And I think you have absolutely done that tonight with your hot takes on NBA traveling.
I'm not going to rest. I'm not going to rest until we get to the bottom of this issue. We need a letter.
Pivots anymore. You never see a good crisp bounce pass in the NBA. More pivoting. They do layups from the left side with their right hand now. It's all gone to shit.
I need an open letter here. I need an open letter here.
Hey, man, good talking to you as always. Want to do this again next week?
Let's do it again next week.
Cool, man. Talk to you then.